Hello and welcome to this week's video of Talking Technical, a new series which we talk about how cameras actually work and how you can use it to improve your photography to go alongside your composition. So in essence, this series is going to be alternating between a technical lesson and a more creative lesson to kind of give you those ideas of how you can use it in the real world. Today we're going to be talking about aperture. Aperture, in essence, is how open or closed your lens is. As a result, this affects your depth of field, which is how much of your shot is actually in focus, as well as the amount of light that's hitting the sensor or the film in your camera. So here I've got one of my favourite lenses. This is a Nikon D lens. It's a 50mm f1.4. This means that it has an incredibly large aperture and lets a lot of light in. As I move the aperture ring, you can see the blades get smaller. Like I said, this has two functions. This allows for a greater depth of field when you are using the lens. So the smaller I make this, the larger our depth of field is, and that means the more of our subject is in focus. The larger I make this means that it lets more light in and we have a shallower depth of field. This means that a smaller amount of our subject is in focus, so this could be something from the eyes, and by the time you get to the hair and moving back, that could be moving out of focus. It depends on how much you open and close it. So now we're going to touch base on more of the mathematical side of this. So the F number is how open your lens is. So the smaller the number, the wider open your lens is. So if we're talking f1.4, that means that your lens is as wide open as it can get, or f1.8 or f2, 2.8, whatever it is, that is the widest your lens can go. The larger the number, the smaller the hole in your lens gets. That means the less light it lets in and the larger a depth of field you have. So this seems a bit counterintuitive, so let's do the maths. So the reason why the smaller the number results in the larger aperture is because the aperture is actually a ratio, so it is 1 to 1.4. So if we have a look at the maths, you can see that f1.4 lets in 0.714. If we move to f2, that lets in 0.5 because you're taking 1 and you're dividing it by 2. 2.8 is 0.357. f4 is 0.35, and so on and so forth. This is why the larger a number you have, the smaller your aperture actually is because it's a ratio of 1 over that number. So one thing that's important to take note is as you move your aperture up and down, in the sense of say one of these older lenses that's got a physical aperture ring, these are done in increments of what is called a stop. A stop is a unit measurement of light. It isn't necessarily a defined unit like a meter or a mile or something like that, but what it is relative. So it is a doubling or a halving of light. So each stop you move on your aperture ring, it either means there's twice or half the amount of light depending on what direction you're moving. So if I'm at f4 at the moment, if I move to f5.6, there is half the amount of light there. If I move from f4 to f2.8, there is twice the amount of light there. What this also means is if I move 2 stops of light, so if I move from f2.8 to f5.6, I'm moving doubling the light, and then I'm doubling the light again, so that gives me 4 times the amount of light. If I move again, relative to that, it's 8 times the amount of light. So each stop you move is a double on the previous value. So this all ties in with what's called the exposure triangle. So you've got 3 elements of this, obviously, what with it being a triangle. So you've got your shutter speed, you've got your aperture, and then you've got your ISO. So your aperture is how wide your lens opens. Your shutter speed is how quickly the shutter moves, allowing more or less light in, and your ISO is your film sensitivity, or the amount that your sensor is adding in to compensate for that. A great way to start using with aperture in mind is to take your camera, whether it's a DSLR, whether it's mirrorless, and put it onto aperture priority. What that means is that you select the aperture and then your camera will make adjustments to compensate to give the correct exposure. This is a super fun way of just getting out there shooting and getting an idea for it. One exercise I'd recommend doing is just taking a photo of something and then stopping down your aperture in increments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate that for you now so you can get a feel for what that looks like. So I now have this camera set up in aperture priority. So what this means is that the camera is going to make the decision of what to set the ISO and what to set the shutter speed to get the correct exposure. Okay, so we're going to start at f1.4, then we're going to move up to f2, then f2.8, f4, f5.6, so this is going to give you an idea, and if you have a look at the background, you'll see how it gets sharper in comparison to the foreground to give you that larger depth of field. So depth of field is something I've covered in a previous video. If you want to have a look at it in a bit more detail, please do check that out. There's two other things worth considering when talking about aperture. One is focal length. So here I've got a 50mm f1.4, which is a very large aperture. Here I've got a 400mm f5.6. On the 50mm, that would give me a very large depth of field, especially if I'm shooting people. It would give me a lot in the background to work with. On a 400mm lens, that in itself, because of the focal length, it is going to give you a very shallow depth of field. A general rule of thumb is a longer focal length will give you a smaller depth of field. A wider focal length will give you a larger one at the same aperture. So if I would shoot both these lenses at f5.6 and get a similar composition, they would come out with very different results when it comes to background blur and getting rid of that background. But again, check out my video on depth of field to have a look at that. So I'm just going to chuck this bit in quick and dirty because this is actually day of release for this video, so I'm chucking it in. I'm just firing up my iMac quickly just to edit this into the video. Talking about the point where I mentioned about how focal length affects depth of field. So you will have just seen the example where I do the 50mm f1.4 and then the 400mm f5.6. I shoot them both at the same aperture, so both at 5.6, and I get a similar composition. Now you see the background actually changes. That's because of perspective, and that's because of the focal length and how it actually contains the image, and how I'm significantly further away shooting the 400mm, so that's why the backgrounds look different. But one thing that actually surprised me was the depth of field was pretty much bang on, like they were pretty much identical. I kind of sat on this for a couple of days thinking, okay, do I just post it as it is or do I put a little thing in? And I decided to, because there's enough misinformation in the world without me having to contribute to any. So it turns out I'm wrong. One thing that I think that I got confused about when I did the video was, so when I shoot in zoos, on 400mm, the lens that I have has a minimum focusing distance of 4 meters. So that means the closest thing you are going to focus on is 4 meters away. So what I do is I use these. These are extension tubes, and what they do, and these are extension tubes, and what they do is they bring your minimum focusing distance closer to where you actually are. So instead of my minimum focusing 4 meters, it might be, say, 2 meters or 2.5 meters. And when you're shooting in a zoo, that makes a huge difference because you do get animals who are closer than that. So trying to shoot that, it becomes very difficult when you've got a minimum focusing distance of 4 meters. So the 400mm combined with the extension tubes, combined with the large aperture for a 400mm lens, there's some examples going over this of basically whenever I've cocked it up because the depth of field is too shallow when you are getting that close. So I think that's where I got it mixed up, so apologies. One other thing to bear in mind when we're talking about aperture is distance as well. So your distance from your subject will affect your depth of field. So if your subject is further away from the camera and you're focusing further out, that's going to give you a larger depth of field. So that's it for today's video. I hope you found it really useful. So in summary, we've covered what the aperture is and how that is calculated, the fact that the larger the number, the smaller the hole opening is and gives you more depth of field, and it also gives you less light. You have a larger aperture that will give you more light but a shallower depth of field. One thing we'll also cover today is stops of light. So how a stop is either a doubling or a halving of light. It isn't a fixed unit of measurement, but it is twice or half the amount of light relative to what it was. And this will allow you to help when you're dealing with the exposure triangle, which we'll cover in another video later on. I hope you found this useful. Enjoy the rest of your day.